electricity is really the most efficient energy source out there, and battery electric propelled vehicles, whether it's bigger trucks or smaller trucks, are the most efficient means of transport. And I think that's where we should go.
Welcome to In Between Charges, the best way to pass time while waiting for your EV to charge. I am, as always, joined by my co-host, Mike Hawks. Mike, how are we doing today?
Doing very well, thanks. Yeah, as always, never a dull moment in this industry. The headlines go from the kind of crazy, right? Tesla letting go 500 employees in their kind of fast charger business, to the maybe more bland. Spain is going to be adopting the ITREC regulation, which is the hardware charging regulation. Maybe our guests can also share a little bit of their thoughts on that one from their experience. And then also to the downright kind of crazy and a little bit random. There's someone who's managed to find a new way to hack the autonomous vehicles in San Francisco by wearing a stop sign of the right sign and standing in front of the car so it interprets them as a stop sign. And also, the best part about this story is that his name is Jason B. Carr. That's just...
Okay.
This is his passion. This is his lifelong interest. So doing well, getting very excited by all the headlines.
Someone read their news this morning. Someone had some time to read the news this morning or listen to a couple of podcasts. So great. So Mike, today, the EV we are waiting on to charge is not your typical EV. It's big. It's real big. One might even say heavy. That's right. We're talking about heavy-duty vehicles and more specifically, the charging of those vehicles. It is a pleasure to have Roel Visser, Chief Commercial Officer from Mylance, on the show. Roel is located in Amsterdam and has been with Mylance, a heavy-duty charge point operator, for a couple of years now, leading their growth and commercial efforts. He has a fairly extensive history in the EV space, having also been the CFO, and if I read your LinkedIn correctly, maybe CEO for a short period of time at Heliox, a Dutch hardware provider of charging equipment for vehicles of all sizes, but notably buses and trucks. So Roel is the ideal person to discuss all things heavy-duty charging. Roel, welcome to In Between Charges.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for having me.
I maybe wanted to start with a brief look at the heavy-duty vehicle scene or landscape in Europe, because we often discuss electric vehicle adoption and the EV charging space, but about 95% of the time when we're discussing that, it's about your everyday cars. It might be Tesla's Q1 sales dipping, or how Chinese manufacturers are going to invade Europe, or how the US is not going to let them invade the US with 100% tariffs. That's what we see in the headlines.
Oh, so you read the news too?
I sometimes do read the news.
That's what we do.
Sometimes read the news. That's like a week-old story. I didn't read this morning as much. But what does not receive enough attention, in our, and I'm sure your opinion, is the electrification of heavy-duty transport. Last year in 2023, if I have my numbers correctly from the IEA Global Outlook, electric truck sales increased almost threefold in 2023 to reach more than 10,000 heavy-duty trucks were sold in Europe. That represented about 1.5% of the market, so not a lot, but 10,000 vehicles is still quite a few. Meanwhile, the new registration of e-buses increased by about 40%, with a market share of 16%. Roel, please correct me if my numbers are incorrect. And then even in your home country, I read that 16,000 plus new heavy commercial vehicles were sold in the Netherlands. So, Roel, what's your kind of view, or Mylance's view, on how the heavy-duty trucking scene is evolving in Europe? Is it growing fast enough? I'm sure it's probably not growing fast enough. And where do you kind of see it headed in this year or next?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think on your numbers, I learned a lot about those numbers in the last 2 years since I joined Mylance. There's a lot of different definitions, right? So trucks, generally, some reports state trucks are all the vehicles with a gross weight above 3.5 tons. Sometimes it's above 7.5 tons. But generally, it's accepted that the real heavy-duty trucks are the trucks above 15 tons or 15 or 16 tons. So a lot of the numbers you just mentioned, and I think that's one of the obviously concerns of Mylance and also one of the reasons why Mylance exists, it's still predominantly the lower vehicle weights which are electrified at the moment. The real heavy-duty trucks, as is our definition at Mylance, right? It's our focus at Mylance. That's the 16 tons or the 15 or 16 tons and above trucks. That's still only a few thousand in Europe. Obviously, that's not enough. Also, that market, by the way, I think the growth figures are relatively similar. So I think the predictions for this year in Europe is that for the 15, 16 tons and above trucks, approximately 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 electric trucks will be sold. And that's in the real heavy, so that's the big trucks. And I think that's also a growth of nearly 100 to 150% versus last year, right? So if we Obviously, I'm Dutch. We're headquartered in Amsterdam, as you said. Looking at the Netherlands, kind of year after year for the last 3 years, the sales of electric trucks doubled year on year. I think that's the trend where we are at today. But obviously, I think when you look at our segment, then there has been some clear CO2 targets set, which will really drive the amount of trucks, electric trucks or zero-emission trucks in this industry. And the targets have been set recently at minus 45% CO2 reduction in 2030 versus 2019. More or less, that means that by 2030, we need more or less 400,000 heavy-duty electric trucks in Europe. So kind of that's the number where we need to go to. The estimates are that there's approximately, well, let's say 6,000 electric trucks in Europe. We are really at the very early stages of electrification.
There's a few questions in there I'd love to go into then, which is, it's very early stage, so why now? You know, you've started to see some markets starting to open up, some transportation routes. So how do you make those choices? Lots of things about the market, but maybe let's start first by understanding a little bit more about Mylance, what you do, what your kind of offering is, and the problems that you're trying to solve within the heavy-duty trucking market.
Yeah, sure. So Mylans, we are a joint venture of 3 truck OEMs. So our shareholders are Volvo Truck, Daimler and Traton. And Traton is the holding company of Scania and MAN. In the end, Volvo is the owner of Renault Truck as well, right? So in the end, kind of our 3 shareholders represent 5 truck brands. And we have been established approximately 2 years ago to be a solution to the chicken and egg situation on public charging. We are a CPO, we are a charge point operator with a dedicated focus to build a European charging network dedicated for heavy-duty trucks in Europe across 15 countries. And we have a clear target to build a network of at least 1,700 charge points before the end of 2027. And in the end, all to support, I think, the joint mission of many in providing a fossil-free transport for all, right? I think that's what we strive for. And our role in this is to build this network, and by building this network to support and accelerate this transition to the electric heavy-duty vehicles. That means that the core activities of our company is to find land, build charging hubs, and in the end for the next 10, 20, 30 years to, well, with the highest reliability and the highest quality to operate this network.
And so the sites themselves are also pretty unique, right? So we're talking 400 kilowatts, 800 kilowatts, starting to explore megawatt charge points as well, right? And specifically for those lorries that are 15 tons and above. Is that correct?
I would say the first market entry today. So our goal is to be a leading company in charging trucks publicly, but we also want to be a technology leader. So we will be one of the first, well, our target is to be the first to actually offer megawatt charging at our charging hubs. The megawatt charging protocol standard is not yet fully finalized yet, right? It's something which is expected for next year, but at least the standard will support any charging up to 3 megawatt per plug. Well, that's not a power that trucks can cope today. The standards will be finalized and will be defined to charge trucks at really high speeds.
Yeah, and it's incredible as well. We had a conversation previously with part of the McLaren Formula E team, and I think the maximum power those batteries could accept was 600 kilowatts, and that would charge it to 80% in a matter of seconds. So when we talk about 3 megawatts, that's very, very powerful charging. You can hear the hum coming from the cable, at least, definitely.
And the heat.
And the heat as well, definitely.
Yeah, the week that we're recording this is the Advanced Clean Transportation Expo that's going on over in Las Vegas right now, actually, which we should be at, but that's another story. But I've seen, I think, multiple announcements from many different hardware manufacturers of their new 1 megawatt charge station, or 1.2. I think ChargePoint had one that was that and everything, and they were showing it off. So it seems like hardware manufacturers are kind of really getting this in gear and getting ready for this, understanding that this standard is coming pretty quickly, right? And they see the value in this because there's going to be a lot of these depots across North America and Europe, right?
Yeah.
Many, yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And maybe then, and just to kind of stay on the topic, Mylance is positioned quite well to define those standards because you're uniquely positioned alongside the collaboration of 5, as you say, different truck brands and the major OEMs in the industry. So you also know the timing as to when these vehicles will be compatible with this type of charging. It's all very well and good saying some manufacturers can roll it out, but if you don't have the compatible vehicle, it's useless. So would you say that's kind of a core part of it? You're designing and developing both the lorries and the trucks themselves alongside the charge points and trying to lead that standard? Is that where Mylance sees itself in the future?
To start, before I really answer this question, I think it's really important to understand that Mylance is really a fully standalone company, right? So yes, we have shareholders, but our shareholders also act as, I would say, as shareholders. So we don't get more information from our OEMs than other CPOs would be able to get. But obviously, at the moment, we are the leading charging network in Europe. At least we have announced the most hubs to be opened very soon. So obviously, we are relevant for all OEMs, but we are equally close cooperation with the other OEMs, which are not our shareholders. We equally will partner with them and cooperate with them to ensure a fully interoperable and a fully reliable charging experience. But obviously, I think to answer your question, obviously we are very active in contributing to finishing the megawatt charging standard. And very often, the best way to finish standardization discussions is just start deploying them. If there's no very clear need to have those megawatt chargers deployed, then you can continue having standardization discussions on many elements, right? So, but if one company really starts deploying them, then at one point in time, it also converges to, okay, then apparently we have a solution that works, right?
Yeah, definitely. For other AC, DC charge points, getting them straight in the ground definitely does facilitate the conversation. But it's also fair to say it's very difficult to get the whole multi-regions really bought into what the minimum standards should be. When we first started Monta, we saw a big fragmentation. Similar in the US as well. A lot of the charge points that will come up against there aren't OCPP 1.6. They are below and earlier.
Well, and now they've gone to NACS, right? To the North American charging standard. So that's a whole different.
It's a whole different ballgame. Yeah.
How's it going so far? Then Roel, just give us an update on the progress. You said Mylance was formed 2 years ago. How many hubs are live? How many hubs are in the pipeline? And where are they located around Europe?
Yeah. Also, we have been indeed on the 8th of July, almost 2 years ago. So it's 22 months now. We have been established, starting with only 6 people. Right nowadays, I think we are close to 160, 170 people across Europe. I think on the network, we have now, today we have 2 sites operational. That's one in Venlo in the Netherlands and one in Rouen in, kind of north of France. And I think in the past weeks, we have announced 2 locations in Sweden, 2 in Germany, 1 more in France. We already have contracted many more locations throughout Europe, but we are quite conservative in our communication. And the main reason is that there's quite some uncertainty in building those hubs, right? As of the first moment you are in contact with any landowner until you're able to open a site often is, 9, 12 or 15 months. One of our core values, which we value very highly, is reliability. But it's not only the charger reliability, but also the reliability in our communication. And then when we tell the people that we open a site, that we also will open that site, right? So that means that a lot of uncertainty on permits, on grid connections, on many other elements, which could be risky in building a hub, first needs to be secured before we start any communication.
And so your customers, you're a charge point operator, and we've spoken with a couple different charge point operators, and we work with them every day here at Monta. You're a little different type of charge point operator. Your customers are not everyday EV drivers, so you're working with trucking companies, which your parent companies, but also you said other manufacturers and everything. And so how you acquire them will be a little bit different than Fastnet or Ionity or something like that. So how do you go about establishing these relationships and setting up win-win relationships between both you and the trucking companies and ensuring that you are reliable and starting to really kind of build this business?
I think this is super interesting about this new market of electrification of the heavy-duty segment. Customers are the EMSPs for us, right? Which are both the traditional oil company, that's the fuel cards, right? The charge cards, but also everybody else who has plans to be an EMSP in the transport industry. I would say almost legally, the EMSPs are our customers, and then the trucks are kind of the users of our hub. But then you also have the truck driver, depending on the truck company. Sometimes the truck driver has quite some autonomy and decision power in where he wants to fuel or charge. And sometimes it's really driven by fleet planners or the transport company.
That's interesting. So I noticed Fastnet has established a number of relationships with EMSP providers, right? These fuel card companies and EMSP providers and everything. But then a driver might have the autonomy to flick through a few different ones and might use one or might choose to use one that maybe you hadn't integrated with yet. And then they're not going to your site. They might go somewhere else. Is that kind of what you're saying?
We want to be, or we will be, a fully open public network. So any EMSP who wants to to contract with us, obviously, with some conditions, but we will allow them on our network, right? Our goal is to have contracted all the relevant EMSPs out there, so that indeed that truck driver who would want to charge at our sites has a very high percentage likely that his card or his transport company contracted is accepted our network. Okay. So your question was also about how do you build relations with your transport companies? We don't have a contractual relation with our transport companies, as kind of the contractual relation is through the EMSP. What we actively do is to actively discuss with the fleet owners, with the transport companies on the design of the network. How should the perfect network look like? And what are the specifications of our charging hubs? What is important to you as a fleet owner and what's important to the driver in kind of amenities or in all kinds of specifications. But in the end, we don't have a direct contractual relation. We try to support and accelerate them into buying more electric trucks and making the transition quicker.
Very interesting. Because I guess my assumption coming into it is that you would have, a select group of fleet companies and businesses that are perhaps more kind of closely affiliated, similar to how some OEMs are creating not necessarily closed networks, but preferential networks for their customers. And I understand that at least in the first stage, it's all about getting the charge points in front of the users via then this growing EMSP network and being a part of it. But do you see that being a long-term strategy and something that you'll be pushing into the future? Will EMSPs always be your primary networks, or are you also envisioning building up, your own kind of brand loyalty around the Mylance network itself as well? Kevin's mentioned Fastnet. It's possibly one of the, alongside Ionity, one of the most successful ones that's built that reputation of quality and reliability and be able to actually deliver a good experience of charging, but other amenities that are on site.
Yeah, very good question, right? I think and let me first answer that more generally. We are very early mature, right, in this whole transition into the electrification of the transport sector. I think many things will change which we don't foresee today, right? And one of the questions you could ask, and I'm not making any statement by this, but one of the questions you could ask is, will the EMSPs be equally relevant in the heavy-duty transport sector as they are in the passenger car transport sector?
Yeah, exactly.
It's a good question.
It has to be a specific EMSP type, right? The BP Pulse and some of these others that
We're kind of an EMSP as well, but I don't think we have a lot of heavy-duty truckers using the Monta app.
I think we have a net total of 0 currently because there's
The industry is differently run, right? Because normally at transport companies, the fleet management systems or the transport management systems are kind of the central software systems driving the intellectual heart of those transport companies. I think so. There's the question is how that ecosystem will evolve over time. No clue. Obviously, I have some views, but let's see where it goes. And on the other hand, the question is actually how many different CPO networks will be out there? Because obviously, if you have 100 or 200 or how many CPO networks, then an EMSP has a much bigger relevance. Then in the end, Mylans will not be an EMSP itself. But how the industry will evolve, that's a very interesting... we could easily spend an hour on that topic only.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely.
We're talking about very early days with 1.5% maybe of heavy vehicle purchases in 2023 were electric, getting a couple sites live, a lot in the pipeline and everything. Mike and I were discussing this morning a little bit where we're talking 1.5%, and when utilization rates are kind of really obviously very important to building this business, what's that like and everything, and you don't have to disclose that. But is it a matter of, okay, there's a real land grab battle going on right now because you need to get this in place before it takes off, or are you able to really kind of identify the good sites and acquire them for Mylans?
Although the question might sound very simple, it's actually a very difficult question. You might argue that there might be more like a grid grab than a land grab. And the question is, there is a land grab, but is the land grab with other CPOs interested in truck charging, or is the land grab actually with logistic warehouses who are equally looking for the same scarce land? And I think it's also very much related to actually I would almost say the European system design on charging, right? So will there be a lot of very small hubs? Will there be some bigger flagship hubs? We have the view also because of the whole convenience offering and a safe and secure element of the Mylans network. We believe that the charging hubs will be relatively bigger hubs. But that also means that you need quite some amount of land. And then you're really competing with, whatever logistic industries looking to build a small logistic box or any other industry. So I think in several regions in Europe, and obviously always close to the big cities, right? Close to London, close to Paris, close to whatever, the Ruhr area in Germany, people fight for every square meter of land, right? So I think we are not per se competing with other truck charging CPOs as such, but there's a kind of land grab in many countries to build new business activities in general.
Yeah, I really love the way that you've phrased it, because you've touched on permitting a little bit before as well in a kind of grid grab. How quickly can you get sites set up? And then also who bears the cost of actually running the new cabling through and getting the kind of power control systems also set up? And a lot of that is borne by the network operator and by the individual who's setting it up. And I think we definitely see it. You're kind of competing with setting up these sites with other new network players who basically just see the site as a high volume, high traffic area, a lot around this European 10T network, the trans-European kind of network. And there's maybe 4 groups. It's the traditional oil and gas companies, the forecourts, where they basically already have the sites, they're well established. It is utility companies, perhaps closer to residential areas, so they have a captive market where they can also kind of upsell preferential retail prices to them. It is then the auto OEMs, and I guess kind of going into this discussion, that's where I grouped Mylance originally, but perhaps you actually come in the 4th group, which is new network players who are either grassroots funded or they're part owned by one of those other 3 providers to be able to kind of set up the sites.
So you mentioned, for instance, the forecourts. And in the end, my view on the future European network will be a mix of everything, right? Like often the answer on those questions. But if you have a look at the forecourts of the current existing oil networks or the fuel companies, you can squeeze in maybe 1 or 2 or megawatt chargers. And maybe if you're a very big forecourt, you can squeeze in 4, right? But if you run the calculations on how many chargers you need, if you really make this transition of this industry, it simply doesn't fit over there. Right? In the long run, it will not fit. But in the short-term transition, as you said, the utilization will be low. There will not be that many trucks. Early stage, it will be an accelerator in building that dense network which is needed to run your logistics, to run your routes. But on long term, it will definitely not be sufficient.
That's maybe it. Your strategy is trying to provide the right mix, and then for a specific group that's maybe a little bit underserved right now. But why right now? These networks are being built. There is a much higher adoption rate for commercial vehicles and vans than there are kind of heavy duty trucks. And I guess that's kind of coming back to Kevin's question. Yes, it could be a land grab. It could also be an opportunity for partnerships. But why is that turning point now for Mylance? Why is it now that you've gone for really kind of aggressively pursuing charge point setup?
That's kind of the reason why we have been established, right? It's to solve that situation of chicken and egg of transport companies who want to buy electric trucks, but only if there's some infrastructure in place. And I would say the traditional CPOs today or the traditional oil companies today, they don't see a solid business case today to build that network based on only a few electric trucks, which might be bought by transport companies. The industry was not really moving for 1 or 2 years. And I think that is also one of the reasons why our shareholders decided, okay, we need to kickstart this industry, and we need a company who does build this charging network. Looking at the technology, and I know that it's a new technology, and many people are unsecure about how the technology will perform. The technology is ready. Even the electric trucks you can buy today, the majority of the companies can run their day-to-day operations with an electric truck today. We are now building this network, and we will really build it fast. So by the end of the year, I will not mention any number, but there will be many more charging hubs in Europe. The majority of the companies can actually run their operations today with the technology which exists today. And that's not even with the megawatt charging. So by actually 2024, 2025 will be very exciting years in my industry, as all the OEMs, and that's not only our shareholders, have announced their new long-haul electric trucks. Some are still targeting to launch them before the end of this year. Many have, either been planned or shifted to the first months of next year. Some of them will be megawatt charging enabled. I've seen some analysis by some independent researchers done, I think a few months ago, but 98% of all transport in Europe can be done electric. on the condition, obviously, that there's some public charging infrastructure in place, where we are working at very, very hard. It's really about showing that the technology works and showing that we are building that network and that we bring that confidence to the industry.
Yes, definitely.
So do you almost not even view the forecourt operators of the oil and gas networks as competition? I know BP Pulse, I think, is building out in a couple spots in Europe along a couple of corridors. They're building out some heavy duty charging. But what you kind of said earlier, your typical gas station, or as Mike calls them, a petrol station, they simply aren't big enough, right? So if we're talking about this heavy duty charging, you're not going to be able to pull into an Uno X or a BP or a Q8, I guess, right? Because they just don't have enough land.
For Mylans, one of the core elements of our offering, of our technology, it will also be a booking platform. Based on many interviews with the industry, we have learned this is the biggest ask. We have started a few months ago to build in-house this reservation engine. If you take booking, booking works if you have a charging site where you have 8 or 16 charging bays available. But if you would have only 1 or 2 bays on a kind of open place as the current forecourts are, how will you make booking work on those places? The future network will be a mix of many different chargers, charging powers, different product offers in the end. And the forecourts will be an important element of the total charging network in the future.
Can we maybe talk a little bit about the economics of a heavy-duty charging site? I think we've touched on it a little bit, but what all goes into standing up a site, and what are you finding to be the biggest choke point? We have our theories. I think maybe I kind of can guess, but you said you're going fast, and some of these sites going up, but a lot goes into this as opposed to some other types of sites and everything.
I think there's not one single answer for the whole of Europe, right? Our total investments in network, you can chop them in a few pieces, right? So you have, obviously, you need the land. You need all the civil works because we are actually building a small secure truck parking. So you need to build all the bays. You have the charging infrastructure, and in the end, you have your grid connection. You could lease the land or you could buy the land. But in the end, so close to London, land is unaffordable. Well, I think that's not a secret. If you look at grid cost, in some countries, the investments into the grid are kind of socialized. Right, so it's kind of paid by the government, and the investment you as a private company have to do to get quite a sizable grid connection is rather limited.
So when you say grid connection, you're referring to the amperage allocation, the cabling as well, setup of control panels, etc., or what parts of it?
It's getting the grid connection. So to get the power on site, so that's not all the energy infrastructure which we need on site, or all the substations on site which we need to distribute the power over all the chargers.
Right, so still quite a small part.
To get the grid connection on site. And that really, the differences are huge, right? In some countries, all the cost is put on the private company requesting that grid connection, right? Typically, grid connections we would need are at minimum 3 to 4 megawatt, up to 10, 20 megawatt if we have larger sites. That means that the investments for such grid connections could, in some countries, easily run into the multi-millions, while in some countries where it's socialized, it's, well, a tenth of that.
And that's before you've even set up the charge point. That's before you've even gone and set up the charge point and made the construction and the sites, etc. Yeah.
You only have a grid connection on your greenfield land. So actually building the site, the civil works, it's only a relatively small part. Charging infrastructure, well, today megawatt charging does not exist yet. And the 400 kilowatt CCS chargers we use today are the same used by car charging CPOs. But two main elements of building this network, it's land and grid connections.
When you're kind of setting up those sites, you've gone through, I forget the number now, but you have a total of at least, you're live in about 6 countries. You've just launched the one in Germany, and you have many more that are kind of coming up recently, right? Is that right?
So today we're live in 2. We will open Belgium, Sweden, and Germany. Right, so that makes, we will be open in 5 countries.
So you're in 5 markets now. You're going to take this business case basically and launch it into 7 other markets by the end of this year, and then basically continue to grow those out. What would you say is the biggest learning so far from Mylance and from your, I guess, own experience point of view about trying to roll out these sites?
Mike and I are thinking about a startup heavy-duty charge point operation business.
Yeah, exactly. We're looking for inside knowledge. We've got a 1 megawatt order in the background of a grid permit.
We need to put it somewhere.
Well, if you have a few 100 million, give me a call, right?
We're not there yet. Crowdfunding's got us to 20 grand.
I think the biggest learning, and this sounds maybe not so exciting, although building charging hubs, most people see that it's quite similar to building a network for passenger cars. But actually, it's, on so many elements, it's different, right? You have a different user, you have a different customer, you have a different user expectation. All this joint collective learning and feedback and iteration we done with the markets, also in how our network should be designed. And that's an incredible amount of collective effort done by all 160, 170 employees at the moment. I think we have such a massive collective IP at the moment in, okay, this is how a network should be built. That's really super valuable. And in the end, the outside world will see that in how quickly we will expand the network in the next weeks and months. But you cannot imagine how endless number of internal discussions we have had on, right, how should we design this charging network for trucks? Where do truck drivers actually want to stop? Or where do we need to build them? Or where does the industry actually need them? It's actually quite a unique situation, right? From a total scratch network design, you can build your network. So no legacy, and then you have to find the land and you have to find the grid connections and you need to be able to build a network.
Fantastic discussion so far. And some of the kind of takeaways I have are, one, grid connections and permitting processes are one of the biggest expenses and also one of the biggest time challenges when setting up a site. And also from your learnings, it takes a huge team and level of effort to be able to design the optimum charging network, basically from the ground up. And I think what we come across a lot in our industry is regulation. Some of them are ahead of its time. Some of them are very much lagging and as a result require a change of strategy. I mean, what role is regulation playing in Mylance's journey so far?
Yeah, like many new technologies or industries, regulation is playing a big role in the speed of how quickly we can build a network. This is a new activity, and very often governments, whether local or national governments, do not know how to cope with this new activity. When we look at regulation and building this network, then for us, it's really about the clarity on what activities can be built or can be deployed, and how quickly, in the end, those building permits or those permits for us to run the activities be given. We see a big difference across Europe, where in some countries that easily takes 6-9 months to get those permits, while other countries have permit blight procedures where only in 4, 6, 8 weeks some permits can be given and a network can be built. There needs to be built such a huge network, and not only by Mylans, right? Let's hope that many other competitors will join and will build this network. The design of the current regulation really slows down the build of the network, at least today at Mylans. But also regulation plays a big role in the grid connections. Again, not one uniform answer across Europe, but in some countries, actually, it's prohibited by regulation for grid operators, for DSOs and TSOs, to do any capacity forecasting on the network. Right? So they cannot expand their electricity networks based on whatever forecasts. They only can build or expand their networks when they have real applications, which makes it a need to expand the network. And that makes it a very slow process. We have had some dialogues and we did share some information, but it's actually not that hard to make a map of Europe or to show some calculation on how much energy the transport sector would need if you would transition to electric, and where more or less we would need that energy.
So, I'm anti-regulation just because I'm American, so it's in my blood to be anti-regulation.
You came to Europe, you must have been like, what the hell is GDPR?
Yeah, I have to click a button at the bottom of every website to read what's going on. It's insane.
Exactly, big impacts.
Do I want to accept cookies or reject them? I never know.
Only the necessary.
I joke, but the flip side, so in regulation, even in America, the grid connection piece is throttling the build out of what we need to do. This is not just in charge point operation, but this is solar panels, this is batteries, this is everything, right? But am I wrong to say another aspect of the regulation that has been maybe beneficial for Mylance and for the heavy duty trucking companies is like the EU saying you need to do this. We're going to cap emissions. We're going to push countries and at an EU-wide level push OEMs and hardware manufacturers to certain levels and everything, so that companies are usually self-interested and are trying to make a profit, right? But we see that when left unchecked, then maybe they're going to take the path of least resistance, right? And whereas in Europe, and that's why it's a bit further along over here in Europe, the heavy duty, especially compared to America, and it's actually coming along quickly in America, in California, because they've put in place these pretty strict caps on everything. Is that you need to do this, and there's huge tax credits, et cetera. And it's the same in Europe too. Like, it's pushing the Mans and the Volvos and the Daimlers, et cetera, of the world to build electric trucks. Is that correct, or?
No, I think definitely, right? What I said before was definitely not a full complaint on regulation only. With the targets which have been set for 2030, we have an AFI regulation which sets obligations on member states to build a certain charging network along the 10T motorways, highways, right? So we definitely have some good targets set by the European Union. Well, I think I still would have some recommendations how to make them even more effective. But I think what we don't have is actually any regulation on the transport sector or the logistics sector itself to go electric. Well, I'm not American, but I sometimes I could have been one. I feel that what really drives the transition, it's about economics. Yeah. We should punish the wrong technology and we should subsidize the better technology. I think diesel is still too cheap in Europe. If you would create the right incentive for transport companies and provide a clear pathway to 2030 to make it clear that every year diesel will become more expensive and running an electric truck will every year become less expensive, then by itself you will create that momentum. Yeah. But transport company, the transport sector is one of the most competitive sectors in the world with super low profit margins. Right, so they don't have big bags of money to, let's try expensive electric trucks. We need to create that momentum also by creating the right business case for the transport companies.
Completely agree. It's super high cost of ownership and entry for any fleet company to be able to start to transition the fleet. You need to purchase the EVs, but you need to also bloat your total fleet size so that you're not, kind of hindering your total volume of distribution or deliveries or whatever that might be. And then you steadily phase out your combustion engine vehicles and you're probably getting, some pretty low scrappage price. I believe that regulation always has good side and a more challenging side. And I think what we're particularly strong at within Europe is setting what the goal should be, but not necessarily planning how to get there. That's very much left up to the private market. And as a result, there are some parts of the regulation that are just missed that then very much hinder against the plan.
Hope is not a plan.
I join you.
Hello there, my name is Rocio. I am In Between Chargers podcast producer, jumping in from the future to point out that you'll soon hear us reference Mylans as a fossil-free company. In reality, they don't claim this, rather than their vision of the future includes fossil-free transport. Thank you, and let's go on.
I'm quite interested, maybe we can just touch on it, but I'm quite interested in something that you mentioned right at the start, Ross, which was we're a fossil-free company. So one is about setting up the network itself, but the other part is, and my interpretation is then ultimately, kind of trading green electrons. I mean, how do you see that within Milence, and what steps are you taking to try to support that fossil-free journey?
It's a very good question and also a very important topic at our company. But it all starts with energy security, right? So all the energy we buy is green energy, right? But I think definitely the people who know the electricity markets or who know the industry know that in the end, I would say near to impossible to literally buy green energy every second of the day. Energy is green because you buy the green certificates, but in the end, there's a mismatch in time. But the first part is obviously about security of energy, so to make sure that we can charge trucks at every time of the day. And secondly, it will be about making that system more advanced, so to directly contract renewable energy sources by PPAs, to see if we can match the demand of certain big fleet owners by, contracting a mix of PPAs to, as good as we can match the timelines of an energy need of those fleets with a certain mix of PPAs. But also what we actively do is that we try to build our charging hubs next to renewable energy sources. So if there is a big logistic hub with a lot of roofs full of solar, or whether there's some windmills close, we also try to contract those energy sources directly. And that comes actually with a few benefits. I think one, it's obviously even more clear where the energy comes from, which is green. But secondly, you put a lot less burden on the grids. To really succeed in this whole energy transition, not only on transport, but in general, we need to start using the electricity a lot more where it is locally produced, right? So to produce it locally, consume it locally. And that's also the view we have with our charging hubs. We will start also to deploy smaller battery systems to, in the end, to optimize the energy mix. In the end, the transport sector is the backbone of the European economy. Right? You cannot make statements like, oh, in the next 2 hours, we cannot do any transport because there's no green energy. The questions I spend most of my thinking time is how influenced will the logistics system be? So what discounts you need to offer them, or what system can we create to kind of steer the system to match the renewable energy generation in Europe? And how to build that system, and whether that system is dynamic pricing or not. Do they like dynamic pricing? Because on the one hand, they really like price security, right? So are they waiting for any dynamic pricing or not? But how to create that system, the booking tool will be one of those systems as well. I think, as I said in the beginning of this podcast, right, we are so early stage in this transition of this logistics system or of this European transport system into a renewable transport system. And I think it will be a very exciting ride and many changes and system changes. It's not a boring job at the moment.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. And I have to say, very forward thinking in how you're considering the setup of these sites, because we talk about electrification of transportation, and that's great, but I also feel like that's kind of one side of the coin. The other part is then making sure they're actually being fueled with green electrons as much as possible and creating a new power market to be able to support that and incentivize people to purchasing renewables and green energy.
We don't want to put heavy-duty charging hubs next to coal-fired power plants? We don't think that's a good idea? Or no? Okay.
We don't do that in Europe.
No, okay. Germany.
What's a coal-fired
You could probably do it in Germany. Now, your sites in Germany, they're not going to be next to the big coal plants that they're keeping open? No,
no, actually, the ones which we announced for this last week, the week before, are actually big next to a very big solar field.
Perfect.
So,
that's good. We support that. We don't support coal here at In Between Charges. We don't. Nor hydrogen, actually. We don't support coal and hydrogen. I think they're both not great. Okay, so Roel, of course, the final question that we pose to every guest on In Between Charges is, if you were to bust one myth about the EV industry or heavy-duty EV industry, what would it be?
I think, and it's a quite general discussion about e-mobility in general, I very often end in those debates on how bad batteries are in damaging the environment. And obviously, I'm not a battery specialist. And yes, right, batteries need a lot of resources. I think when we have discussions on those batteries, I think I very often miss two elements in the discussion. One element is the fact that batteries have a second use, or maybe even a third use, after they have been used in whatever vehicle. And secondly, and you can also see that in the recent years on the developments in battery technologies, also, I think in battery technology, we are still quite early stage. And you see how many different battery materials and technologies already have been developed in the last 2-3 years based on way less harmful materials. I think we should not reflect the history on the future. And there will be so many battery technology developments in materials and capacity and performance. Electricity is really the most efficient energy source out there. And battery electric propelled vehicles, whether it's bigger trucks or smaller trucks, are the most efficient means of transport. And I think that's where we should go.
Yeah, there's an example from, I don't know if it's where you're located exactly, but the Ajax Football Club, right? Maybe you know about this. They're reusing batteries from old Nissan Leafs to help power the stadium, right? Because they realized that, maybe a Nissan Leaf battery at 70% is not great for a driver, but 70% battery can still be used for a lot of other things. The possibilities that come afterwards are going to continue to evolve. You're going to get startups and companies that figure out, or football clubs that figure out how to use it. And I think it's pretty ignorant when people just say, batteries require materials as well and minerals and everything, and they require emissions to produce. Well, most things require emissions to produce, but people are going to figure this out.
Yeah, I agree.
So, Roel, thank you so much for joining In Between Charges. This has been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It has been a very nice conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you.
And that'll do it for this episode of In Between Charges. If you have any feedback or ideas for future episodes, feel free to reach out to us on LinkedIn or any of our other social media channels. We do read our DMs. And if you like this episode, please do leave us a rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. That would help us out a bunch. And we'll speak to you next episode. Happy charging out there.